I think new technologies to improve food systems are waiting for government to show up.
Yeah.
And it's not about handout. It's about recognizing that these investments are key for social well-being.
Hello, Food Chain. This is Sharon Chiton, and I'm a food tech junkie and innovation nerd who loves a good story. This podcast combines all of my favorite vices into a deep dive about the problems our food system faces and the visionary people working on solutions. Today, we talk to Dan Altschuler, managing partner at Unovis Asset Management and a leading voice in food innovation and sustainability. Together, we'll explore the challenges and the importance of technology in reshaping the food chain. From plant-based diets to investments, this episode dives deep into a path to a more resilient future for our global food systems. Are you ready? Here we go. Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sharon. It's great to see you.
I'm excited to have you on today. So, before we dive into all things food system-y, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up doing what you're doing today?
Happy to. So I was born and raised in Mexico City, and food has always been a very important part of my life, as it is with many people, in terms of my relationship with food and family and being with friends. And just, I've always enjoyed it. And if I look back on my professional career, food was there from the very beginning, even though it was not by choice, just by a circumstance or happenstance. I started working in corporate banking and for an American bank, but working with a lot of Mexican corporations like Maseca and Herdes and Bimbo. And I got to see a little bit of the financial elements of a food business. Then I managed a family-owned logistics company with some food service and CPG clients. So I understood the complexities of moving boxes from A to B, particularly in a complex city like Mexico City, as and always will be. From there, I moved to the US. I started working with different food companies, helping them explore the distribution channels in the US. And I got the entrepreneurial bug. I ended up launching a CPG brand of natural snacks. And it came about after a conversation with a college professor who told me that in Mexico back then, 50% plus minus of Mexico's harvest lay waste on the fields because farmers did not have the money even to take them to the local markets.
Oh.
And that amount, it just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there has to be a solution. There has to be a way to do this, to fight the challenges of perishable fruits and to find a way to bring great products, because Mexico has one of the most delicious fruits and vegetables I've ever tried. So I launched Bodhi Natural Snacks. It was a 5-year roller coaster where I developed the products with some R&D. I worked with farmers in the state of Puebla. I created a brand. I got into distribution, and eventually I was on shelf. And wow, did I make all the mistakes possible. That could be for a completely other podcast, but I learned a lot during that time. And I also ended up opening a restaurant in New York City with some friends, a tiny hole in the wall called La Barra that served delicious tacos and ceviches. So those were my entrepreneurial projects. After that, for one reason or another, I ended up managing a creative agency, again, with a lot of food service and CPG brands. So the whole value chain from ideation all the way through marketing and branding, I had been involved in it.
Yeah.
After the agency, I took some time off with my wife and we went traveling around the world, backpacking primarily through Southeast Asia. And I got to see the different fields and the different produce, the mango plantations, the rice fields in Vietnam, the tea plantations in southern India. And I was just enamored with it. And at the same time, I saw the challenges and the complexities. And when we came back to the US, we landed in San Francisco and I had decided 3 things. One, I wanted to work on food, but the food of tomorrow, not the food of today. Two, I wanted my work to have a positive impact on the world because we wanted to start a family. And three, I thought my skills would best be from a strategic point of view rather than operational. I started looking at the landscape and a lot of things were popping up. It was a great time for food tech. So we had the rise of indoor farming, which I still am very, very bullish about. We had all these companies trying to understand how best to use excess products, upcycling, waste reduction, very needed. And the third one was alternative proteins. And that one piqued my interest the most. I thought this made sense at this time. I to try the first tasting for Impossible Foods at Le Jardin, and I was sold. I actually have a post on that on my Instagram. I started meeting people and I bumped into Chris Kerr, who is now my partner at Unovis,
Yeah.
just slightly after he had started managing our first fund, which was called New Crop Capital. The thesis was replacing animals within the global food supply. And we started doing early stage investments in companies replacing animals through plant-based sources, through fermentation, and also investing in cultivated or cellular or lab grown meats. And, 8 years later, we are wrapping up our second fund. We are working on a third fund and continue to believe that A, I love the space. B, there are a lot of challenges, and C, there are a lot of opportunities to do good, to do well. So I'm very excited about that.
Wow. I have known you for like 8 years and I didn't know that part of your life. I guess I needed to interview you for that.
Yeah.
I guess your background must really help you, especially with the startups that you see. So you mentioned obviously broader food system, and boy, do we have a lot of challenges, right? From agriculture to food waste to the alternative protein space. And sometimes I feel like we tend to see all these pieces of the value chain are just that, right? Instead of seeing, and maybe that's just me, that they all are extremely related to one another, even if we talk about sustainability. Like one of my hangups have always been, especially with plant-based, for example, is we cannot use the same protein sources for everything, right? Like, how do we go towards more sustainable protein sources? How do we look at biodiversity and look at what crops maybe are more local in certain parts of the world and might not others, right? So how do we make that sustainability aspect even more sustainable? How do we really look holistically, I would say broader, in a broader sense, not just at the just solutions, but also at the challenges. So my question to you is, A, do you agree? But also, how or if do these challenges come up in your work?
I agree, particularly in the sense that it's a very, very complex system that is constantly changing,
Yeah.
very fragmented. And as humans, we have very little control over it. We need to recognize that nature, the weather, the earth plays a much broader part than we'd like to recognize. And at the same time, as consumers, we're very picky.
Yeah.
If our favorite product, fill in the blank, it can be, your vanilla ice cream, it can be your pizza, whatever it is. If it doesn't taste the same, even if it tastes better or different, we're like, we don't like this.
Yeah, we're smart.
And we need to be okay with diversity, to your point. I think we need to recognize that there isn't one answer to these challenges. It's not going to be two answers either. It's not going to be a Coca-Cola, Pepsi world, an Apple, Google world, or whichever, analogy you want. We need to recognize that yes, there are going to be some underlying themes around the world, but at the same time, because of geography and climate and culture and all these other tastes that make each different culinary cuisine, so unique and special and different, they're going to require different approaches.
Yeah.
And I see that a lot with the founder that I have the privilege of working with and sharing my story, and sometimes telling them, no, please don't do it this way. Please don't do it this way. Because I know I've tried that path and I know where it leads. It's not because I see around corners, but many times we are looking for the answer.
Yeah.
And we think that we can create the system and the platform. And once it is done, it continues working in parallel, and that's not food. In every food manufacturing facility, it takes a lot of energy to put it together, to get it up and running. But then every day you're going to have to tweak it and to make sure it is clean. And the formulations are going to change slightly because the ingredients, the more natural, especially the ingredients are, they're going to have different levels of acidity. They're going to have different flavor profiles.
Yeah.
So it's very complex. And I think that sometimes it's harder and harder for people to recognize this because more and more, I think people want simple answers.
Yeah, that's very true. And there's a lot. I want to dive into that. So, obviously, food system is very vast. And before we dive into the alternative protein space, and maybe like looking back, because even look maybe at the mistakes that one has made, right? Like, especially now that the sector is getting so much pushback and we have to shoulder, I think, a little bit of the blame. What are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges or the biggest hurdles that you see for this whole sector to sort of move forward and have the chance that I believe not only it deserves, but it's desperately needed, if you know what I mean?
So I'm going to take a step back and say what I'm going to talk about applies both to alternative proteins, but to the broader food system ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah.
I think we need to take a step back and recognize that in the 19th and 20th century, food companies were given a task: make more food, get it to more places. They accomplished their goal. Unfortunately, and I don't think it was out of malice, it was out of accounting and financial performance and just being able to get things done. The food that was produced, the mindset around food is causing the second and third level consequences to the environment and to our health.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very big system that is, has a lot of inertia around it. And at the same time, we can't put a stop to it because then we'd stop feeding people.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to set the ground and to recognize that all these very large food companies, they're accomplishing the goal of feeding people. Population exploded in this past 100 plus years. Everywhere is all over the place. And then us as consumers, we want our preferred crops all year round. No. So that's a challenge. So now what do we need to think about? We need to think about, as demand continues to increase, because there's more of us, and countries such as China or India or Indonesia with very large populations have more discretionary spending available, there needs to be more calories available.
Yeah.
So that in parallel, yields are coming down because we have taxed the agricultural system more and more. So I think first we need to set the premise that we need more food, but the food that we need needs to be better for us.
Oh, yeah.
And I think here's where technology is going to play a part. It already played a part. We have all these different artificial preservatives. We have all these other ingredients that were found. And I think those were the quick fixes. And I firmly believe that there's going to be new ways for technology to replace these quick fixes with ways that are better for us. What would I like to see? I would like to see people have a more plant forward diet.
Mm-hmm.
In part because that would mean less animal consumption. In part, that would improve their health. Having a plant forward diet or plant based diet can extend your life and the quality of your life. At the same time, there's certain diet related diseases that are terrible for us, cancer, heart disease, etc. And they're also very expensive for society.
Yes.
US alone, it's calculated that more than $1 trillion are spent in medical expenses and in lost productivity from diet related diseases.
Oh, yeah.
And that's just the US. And unfortunately, the trend is being seen around the world. Mexico has one of the largest obesity and diabetes rates ever, something that was not the case 40 years ago when the majority of the population ate rice, beans, and corn tortillas.
Yeah.
So,
malnutrition is the leading cause of death globally. And one doesn't think about how many things are related to food, right? Like an explosion of immunitary disease and an explosion of type 2 diabetes or diabetes, cancer, heart attacks, obesity, you name it, people have it. It's everywhere. And sometimes you think, obviously, with the amount of poison that we put in the ground, that then we swallow right up, right? Like we have to find better ways to feed ourselves, to your point. I mean, I would say we live in systems. So obviously issues in the US are different than but even issues in parts of the US are different climatically, right?
very different. The southern part of the United States versus the Pacific Northwest, you have different eating habits. You have different culinary tastes. You have different purchase power.
Yeah.
Food deserts is one of the saddest things in the US. I've lived in this country for over 20 years. I've had the privilege of traveling a lot of it. And there's some parts of the US where getting some fresh vegetables at a restaurant is not possible.
Yeah.
And that blows my mind. And it's not like the person at the restaurant doesn't want to serve it, is that for their perspective, it's very expensive. And then there's a culture that people have shied away more and more for, carb heavy, animal protein heavy dishes.
Yeah.
And so there is this part that as a society, we need to recognize that if we want to be better, we need to do better.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what do you say to, again, like you live in the US and I mean, not to dive into politics, but I am a little fearful about all this climate denying propaganda. A lot of young people have a lot of eco anxiety. Yeah, a lot of young people see climate change as one of the leading issues. But then on the other hand, you also have people that don't believe it exists. And as a mom and you're a dad, how do you reckon that? Like, because in a way, then it's harder. Like even I think for startups, whether it's climate tech, food tech, ag tech, that we have the message of wanting to go produce better food that's good for people and planet. If you don't believe that bit is there to begin with, do you ever think about that? Or is it just me?
I think there's definitely a lot of anxiety around. I personally think that social media has played a big part in distorting our views. I think more people have things in common than they think, than they recognize.
Oh, yeah.
And I've never met a parent that doesn't want the best for their children, regardless of their political persuasion or anything. So I would say that maybe sometimes it's just about doing the work and giving the time. When we were talking, you were asking about some of the learning lessons from the past couple of years, and there's a lot. And rather than saying there's a lot of blame to point, I think we all shoulder some of the mistakes and we have the benefit of wanting to learn from them or not. No different than in any other industry. the internet 1.0, e-commerce at the beginning, pets.com, early 90s, they wanted to deliver dog food. The idea was there. The time was not right. So that's how I think of alternative proteins to a certain extent. But as I'm thinking about the learning lessons, one of the things was that in many ways, products under-delivered what was over-promised because of such a strong emphasis on marketing, because everybody wanted to ramp up sales, and grow at an unprecedented rate, month over month over month. And I think in food, you have to give it time. Yes, you can build a large company, but it's going to take time to understand your product. It's going to take time to connect with your consumer. You're not going to get it right the first time around. Just recognize that, and it's okay. We're all human. But if you take the time and do it in a very controlled way, then you can learn. And the more you learn and the more you listen, the more you understand what your consumer wants, not what you think they want, but what they want, and how you can address it. And then slowly you can start building and finding other consumers. It's not a social media app. It's not a SaaS platform. It has the complexities of transporting atoms from A to B, applying different types of chemistry, heat, pressure, other processes, all with very tight margins.
Yeah.
So I think it is recognizing where were the value propositions right? Where was the execution incorrect, or what part of the execution? And then how can we do it better?
Yeah. So let's dive into the alternative protein, obviously, that you just mentioned. And to your point, on some things, maybe a little bit of misinformation plays a part. There's nothing to fear, right? When I was young, it wasn't like every restaurant was a sushi restaurant, right? And now everybody's eating sushi. People can change their palate, right? Their behaviors can change, and it's not something that it's like, oh my God. Give us a little bit of your perspective of where the industry is, because obviously there was very rapid growth. We're in a little bit of a slump today in terms of funding, although I see, funds and deals being done every day. And what do you see are the current challenges, and are some of these current challenges driven by the rapid growth and what you called before the sort of overpromising of it all, if that makes sense?
Yes. So first, some of the challenges is what I mentioned. I don't think a lot of companies had what in tech is called product market fit.
Mm-hmm.
What they were selling, people weren't buying. But let's just recognize that just because you can manufacture something, have amazing packaging, a great brand, and put it on shelf, doesn't mean that someone's going to take it off of shelf.
Yeah.
And even if they do, it doesn't mean that they're coming back. So I think that was one of the biggest parts. Second, I think some companies were under this false impression that growth in sales was the only thing that mattered.
Mm-hmm.
And their margins did not matter because there would always be another pool of capital, another round to raise, so to speak. And that false sense of security emboldened, I think, too many companies to rent bigger space, to have much more aggressive marketing campaigns, to have huge R&D budgets. Now, in hindsight, again, we need to own our part of the equation. If you're evaluating a startup or their projections, just compare their P&L to any of the couple of publicly traded food companies. And if you see big distortions in how money is spent, then I think it's important to rethink how you're going to approach things. Just because these companies are old doesn't mean they don't know what to do. This idea that you need to break and disrupt, I think we should give them a lot more credit because day in and day out, there's a lot of companies that are feeding billions of people around the world. They have their challenges. They can do better. There's always an opportunity, but don't discard them right away.
Yeah, I agree with that. You brought up an interesting point because that's exactly what we saw. We saw this mega push where everybody was going out and more money, more manufacturing plants, more humongous things. And then last year it was either mega debts or closing or selling. In a way, in hindsight, it's like, okay, but if we're trying to break new barriers, one of the things was even the language, right? Like, we are the future and you big companies or you farmers are the past. Which obviously then you create some kind of like, who are you to tell me?
There's a lot of, look, a food executive from a very large food company that I appreciate his thoughts a lot on. He told me once, in food, we don't grow into our facilities. We outgrow them. And that mindset was not there. I saw so many people renting, how much space? Oh, 3 times what we need today. Why? Because we're going to fill it up eventually. And this idea, and it's like the amount of money that was not properly spent, which could be put in. And part of it was that people received a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they felt the pressure to spend it. So again, the blame is the ecosystem. It's the times. There was a lot of money. COVID happened. There was this broad general awareness of what some people already knew was that we needed to change the system. There was an increased concern around how food systems are going to react to changing weather patterns. Mm-hmm. So all of this perfect storm happened. And then alternative proteins was, boom, deep in the middle. It was a poster child. That's why I say it's never good to be number one at anything. Be number two. Less pressure, less spotlight. You can operate more freely. It was just a poster child of where everybody wanted to invest. Beyond Meat, is Beyond Meat a success or a failure? In so many ways, it's a success in the sense that you had this one entrepreneur who had a vision and was able to execute on that vision. Financial performance, some people have made money, some people have lost money. But we need to, nothing is white and black. Nothing is, so we need to take things with a little broader vision and understand them more deeply.
Do you feel sometimes, I feel sometimes the alt protein space was also, yes, to everything we just said, but also scapegoat. And what I mean by that is, look at the ban for, cultivated meat. I'm like, what are you banning? Something we don't even have. And obviously they ban it right when there's maybe laws to be passed of things that are actually happening today that should be mitigating climate or anything, right? Like stuff on climate, resilient agriculture, whatever that is. Oh no, let's just go ban the first thing that's not ready, not there for people. And so I feel sometimes it's also because of, let's say, the noise, the being number one, as you said, it's also become a little bit of a scapegoat.
I think you sometimes have well-intentioned people who are malinformed, or you sometimes have economic interests that find a way to push an agenda. And we also need to take timelines. Again, going back to timelines. Yes, today, products that are not readily available because they're not ready for market have been banned. But what will happen when they are readily available? That ban will probably be overturned. No. I have had conversations with people in government who represent, who their populations have strong interest in cattle. And they recognize, they're not going to broadcast it because what's the point of broadcasting it today? To a certain extent, these companies, they were very loud, in part to raise funds But maybe after raising it, it would have been best to just, go back, hunker down, get off the social media platforms and come back when you're ready,
Yeah.
And so the time constraints or the time elements of this equation, they might need to be rethought to a certain extent. But maybe that's no longer possible in the world that we live in, because people will only pay attention to things that they see in their news feed.
And even if you even talking to people that have strong interest in sort of the meat production industry, right? I was reading, what is it, in California now, they want to ban intensive animal farming. Did I just read an article about that? So regardless if you're pro or against, but with everything that is happening between wildfires or Eileen or, wouldn't it be better to diversify your revenue, right? So a little bit you can create in one way, a little bit in another. If a disaster happens, you covered your ass. And maybe that would have is a better way, I would say, to invite people to keep an open mind, right? It's not about taking away, but it's about, look, the more you diversify, the more possibly less risk and more economic return. That's sort of where I see it. What do you think about that?
I would very much welcome a return towards the center. We're talking about food right now, but I think this applies to so many other things.
Yeah.
And recognizing that at the center, when you don't say you are one way or the other, where you recognize that just like a good investor is going to have a diversified base, the food system should have a diversified base. And there is room for all. There is room for different ways of thinking.
Oh, yeah.
There is respect. And there is probably an inclination to be curious about what the others are doing and why. And maybe I might like a little bit of that. And it's okay.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we can have blinders on, right? I think we're shifting a little bit to politics. But one of my favorite podcasts is a Republican podcast.
Which one?
It's The Bulwark.
I don't know that.
Oh, yes. And I mean, if I have to identify myself, I'm definitely a Democrat, but they're all, well, they're never Trumpers, but they are all people that worked in public life, past Republican administrations, or moderate people, that don't like the extremes. But whether they're on the right or the left, I don't like extremes at all. I would just like to have a normal country. That's all.
My favorite podcast is Professor Galloway, Prof G, and who's actually talked about alt proteins. And curiously enough, for him, I would never have thought it. I respected it. His view was from an animal welfare perspective that we should do a shift. And in part, he was talking about it. He has, I think, a big Great Dane that he really loves. But I think, look, it's also, if we take a look back 8-9 years ago, when I told my family and friends that I was going to start investing in vegan companies, they were like, "You've joined the cult, California, and you have joined the cult." Yeah. And today, most of them, if not all of them, have a strong understanding of what alt proteins are and have probably tried at least one of the products. And that's, that is a broad shift in awareness. And that's where it begins. So I'm very bullish about the future. I'm bullish about the category. I just think we need to recognize that in the same way that today you can grab out your phone, click a couple of buttons and have something delivered, within the hour. In the late 90s, when I was living in Boston, dial up, you could order something. Eventually it would come. It was very expensive. And most of those companies went away with the exception of Amazon. So we always expect things to happen much quicker than they do. And I think from alt protein perspective, we just need to get to that tipping point, which will bring back forward progress. Now for food systems, I think we have bigger challenge.
Yeah.
You asked me what we're talking about, what we wanted to, if I had a magic wand.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to make fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, readily available to everyone everywhere at a reasonable price. That to me is probably the most disruptive thing we could do to improve our health.
Yeah. That's a nice one. You're the first person that said that. You're definitely the first person. So if you close your eyes and you look in the future, and I know, let's say 2050 is right around the corner in some ways, so you can even go later than that. How do you envision our food system? Have we gotten our shit together or no?
I think all the major players are going to still be around, but in different ways. I think the concept of the supermarket is going to evolve. I think they will be, to a certain extent, more involved in manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
I think localized production of certain things, local harvesting will happen more. I do think that certain categories, what today is called ultra processed,
Yeah.
I think they're going to go through transformation and it'll take time. But I think on the other side of the equation, they will continue to bring to market the products that people love. Come on, like people love a Twinkie.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, it's not good for you, but people love a Twinkie. I yearn for the day when that Twinkie will either bring you some certain level of nutrients or at least be net neutral.
Well, we have the technology for at least part of that, right? Like with all the sugar reductions and better ingredients, possibly you could do a healthy Twinkie.
I think that the way that people eat, the way that people's dishes account for different parts of the dish, if you will, I think that will shift. I think we will see more grains. I think we will see less animal protein. I think we will continue to see more and more mixes between different types of cuisines.
Mm.
So your point about sushi in the 80s was very, very particular to California and the California roll. And if you went to the Midwest, it'd be like, I've heard that some people eat raw fish. And that's not no longer the case. And that is not just for the US, that is around the world. So I think that continuous mashing of cultures through food will continue and it'll make us all richer in the process. So.
And in terms of technology, what do you think the three things, whether it's, I don't know, 3D? Oh my God. Side note. I was in Dubai a couple of weeks ago. There's this Israeli company, and literally what they're doing is they're growing meat on trees. Did you see that?
First, do
Don't look at your face.
you remember the name of the company?
I have it written down. There you go. It's called Meat Guard.
I want to check them out. You were asking about technologies.
Yeah.
So broadly, I think indoor farming that requires it's a mesh of a lot of different technologies. I think it's here to stay. I think the economic models weren't properly accounted for at the beginning, but in general, indoor farming that includes robotics, that includes different ways to make sure that they're energy efficient and at the same time sterile and clean will be a very big part of the future. I think fermentation in all its sorts is going to play a broader and broader part in both products and ingredients.
And packaging, maybe.
And packaging. You know, one of our companies, they started mycelium for packaging. Now they're mycelium for bacon. Tomorrow, who knows? But yes, definitely. So fermentation as a broader technology, I think will come. I believe that molecular farming and the expression of different types of proteins and enzymes that usually were found in animals, I think they're going to find their way into the field because I think it's going to become much more resource efficient, and it will also decrease our reliance on huge herds of animals and all of the challenges that that brings, from resource to animal suffering to the amount of chemicals that eventually end up in our system.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I would just like to thank, because we've gotten to know each other now for the better part of a decade. And I think not just the work that you do, but the smile that you bring to it, because I've always seen that smile, is, it makes it so much more enjoyable. And so thank you for everything you do.
Check. Oh, thank you. Are you kidding? We're little change makers spirit that we both have.
What we are.
Yeah. So my last question, which ties into the other one. So your technologies, in order to get there, what is the one thing, or at least what are some of the things that you see in terms of policy or investments or partnerships or collaborations, you name it, that are absolutely crucial for us to actually get there?
I think, and I'll address it to the US, but I think it applies more broadly. In the same way that the automotive industry required the highway system, in the same way that the telecom revolution required investment in infrastructure, in the same way that the agriculture industry today receives a significant amount of subsidies, which there's a reason for them, so people don't starve. I think new technologies to improve food systems are waiting for government to show up.
Yeah.
And it's not about handout. It's about recognizing that these investments are key for social well-being. Should they be direct investments in infrastructure? Oh, who's that?
My dog.
Beautiful. It would be through R&D. Yeah. Should it be through direct investments? Yes. Should it be through preferential loans? Yes, yes, yes to all of the above. Recognizing that not all of the money will generate a return, but just like you do in every other industry, you need to be able to promote the people who are thinking differently.
Yeah.
And at the same time, invite the broader industry to play nicely.
I couldn't agree with you more. Really. Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Sharon. Great seeing you.
Great seeing you. Want a deep dive into food innovation? Subscribe to the Food Tech Junkies series. Tune in and listen to the industry's champions, whose mission is to reinvent our future by collaborating and disrupting the status quo as a way to rebalance our planet and our daily lives. For more great food and ag tech content, visit our website at www.edibleplanetVentures.com, and don't forget to follow us on social media.